Gilmore Girls is a show that is known for its female relationships, but the relationship that has moved me the most on the show is actually one between two men. This is the relationship between Luke and Jess. The show doesn't have too many male relationships, and I think that this one is just such a beautiful, beautiful representation of a love and affection between two men, and what demonstrates the strength of this relationship is not what is said, but what is done. I wanted to make this video to talk about the evolution of their relationship and why I think they may have the most subtle, most beautiful, and most touching relationship on this show. Let's start with season 2. We first encounter Jess in episode 5, and we see that Luke is buying a bunch of groceries for Jess's arrival. So from the very, very outset, Luke is already trying to anticipate Jess's needs. He's buying food that he wouldn't buy for himself. We know that Liz sent Jess to Luke because Jess has been getting into trouble. Luke doesn't even know what kind of trouble Jess has been getting into, and Luke is blaming his mom for Jess's behavior. So right off the bat, Luke is forgiving of Jess's behavior because of his upbringing. In their very first meeting on the show, we can see how similar they are when it comes to their communication style. They're very laconic, very few words are spoken between them, and they're both cool with it. Luke is also trying to be as accommodating as he can be. Jess is not being the friendliest. You can tell that he's very bitter about moving, but I think that Luke actually works very well for Jess because if he was quirky like the rest of the town, Jess would have bolted right away. The fact that Luke is so taciturn, so grumpy, is actually quite beneficial for Jess because as soon as Jess arrives, he needs someone who he can relate to, someone who he feels is at least a little bit similar to him, and a quirky personality would have just driven Jess crazy and I think more out of bounds. So pretty much as soon as Jess arrives, he decides to go out and Luke doesn't ask him where he's going. And this is a scene where Lorelai judges Luke for not asking Jess any questions about where he's going or what he's doing, and Luke comes to his defense saying, well, he's a 17-year-old kid, he's not a child, and he's in a town that only has 12 stores, which I kind of agree with. Jess comes from New York City, so moving to a small town, I think he's pretty safe, although to Lorelai's point, if anyone has ever moved from New York City to any suburb, you get lost so fast because there's always a genius who decides to name a bunch of streets starting with the same letter and they all loop around each other. So I do think there's a higher chance of getting lost in the suburbs than there are in the city because of the grid system. But in either case, I also like the fact that Luke is actually not overbearing right away. He gives Jess a lot of freedom. And the suggestion that Lorelai makes, I think, is coming from a good place, but I don't think it works in Jess's case. When Lorelai introduces herself at the diner, Jess doesn't say anything to her. And again, Luke comes to Jess's defense saying that, he's probably miserable about moving here, which really shows that Luke right away understands Jess's perspective. He understands the bitterness. He understands his parents, so he knows where he's coming from. So in the very beginning, Luke is being overly accommodating when it comes to Jess because I think he sympathizes with Jess. Lorelai tries to do another sweet gesture. She invites Jess and Luke over for dinner as a welcome to Jess. And some fans have pointed out that this was probably a stupid idea considering that the welcome party was all adults plus Rory. That for a new kid, for a 17-year-old who's just moving, it may be a little much to only introduce him to a bunch of adults. Although, of course, Rory would also be there, but it just doesn't seem like the right welcome party. But I do think that Lorelai did have good intentions. And then we get the very big scene between Lorelai and Jess, where Jess, in my opinion, steps a bit outside the bounds by attacking Lorelai and suggesting that she is sleeping with Luke. When I originally saw this scene, I was very much in Lorelai's defense, and I still think that Jess was out of bounds with the statement that he made. However, in that discussion, what I think is very interesting is that Lorelai is in some ways trying to relate to Jess. She says that she gets it. She also has a chip on her shoulder. She understands what it's like to have parents that stifle you. But I do think there's a very big distinction between what happened to Lorelai and what has happened to Jess. And I think it's a very natural and very human to project your own experience onto others as a way of relating. But in this particular situation, the major difference, I think, sets these two characters apart because Lorelai's problem with her parents was the fact that they were controlling and overbearing. They were crushing her with their attention, whereas Jess has been completely neglected. He has been cast aside. Neither one of them is good, but they are different, and I think they require different approaches. Later on, Jess gets into more trouble in the episode. He steals a gnome, he takes money out of Dosie's market, and Luke decides to push Jess in the lake, which is, I think, quite a standout moment of the show. And I think it was actually a great way of Luke showing that he's not a pushover. I think he acted purely in the moment, but I think it was also a great power move because yelling wouldn't have worked. To be clear, I don't promote violence, and I don't think that pushing people into lakes is a good approach in general. I think just in the context of the show, it kind of made sense for those two characters. In the very next episode, we see the first signs of the teasing relationship between Jess and Luke. Jess dresses up like Luke and acts like him in order to mock him. In episode 8, we have Mia visiting Stars Hollow, and she meets Jess for the first time. And she points out that Luke wasn't a very talkative boy, just like Jess when he was his age. In this episode, Jess draws a chalk outline outside of Dosie's Market, and Rory yells at Jess for making Luke's life harder. This is where it registers for Jess for the first time that the town is very hard on Luke. And I don't think he knew that beforehand. Jess shows genuine remorse when he finds out, and this is probably the first time that his actions are affecting someone else and that he knows about it. At the end of the episode, we see that Jess fixes Luke's toaster, but he doesn't want to tell him that, so he can only show his affection subtly. It's this acts of service without being too overt. And it might be the first sign of Jess warming up to Luke and showing appreciation, although in this episode it was Rory that pushed him. In the Bracebridge dinner, Luke confesses that he lied to Jess about his mom not wanting him to come back for winter break, and this entire situation is incredibly heartbreaking. I absolutely love the fact that Luke loves Jess enough to want to protect him because he knows how much it would hurt. And the fact that Jess already knows the truth is incredibly painful. He is aware of the fact that his mother didn't want him home. She didn't even call.
It makes me sick.
So Jess is aware of the fact that Luke is willing to lie to him to protect him. At the Bracebridge dinner, we also see that Luke and Jess have a very similar reaction to the dinner.
Cream. Green stuff? I think it's best picked off.
So we have all those similarities running between them and how they react to the town. In episode 15, Jess and Luke are having living situation issues. Their place is a mess because there's too much stuff. Luke also asks Lorelai if she would be willing to give Jess the job of cleaning her gutters. So Luke is already thinking of Jess. He wants him to have the opportunity to earn some extra cash and also probably the opportunity to get to know Lorelai and get used to the town a little bit more, to have some sort of activities going on. When both of them are looking for apartments, it's cute. They're actually negotiating, so maybe they're not agreeing on everything, but they are trying to work through their living situation. There's one cute scene also when Luke comes home and he says he can't live like this anymore. Jess's stereo is blasting, and before he leaves the room, he turns the stereo on again because Jess says that he can't sleep without it, which is, I think, incredibly sweet when you think about it. Luke is willing to put up with that loud music because he needs it to fall asleep. And in the final scene of the episode, Luke has another power move where he just grabs a hammer and knocks down a wall, which shows that Luke can be a little unpredictable, and I think maybe shows Jess that Luke operates in a unique way.
That's your room. Finish up. We'll hold hands and skip afterwards.
Episode 17, we see that Jess is not helping Luke out when the diner is busy while Luke is planning his uncle's funeral. So Jess is still not at the point where he shows his love for Luke. And Rory has to drag Jess to help Luke out. But we do see that Jess and Luke sit next to each other during the town meeting, and they are quipping back and forth. Episode 19, Luke is called to the principal's office because Jess is flunking out of school. So Luke asks Rory if she would tutor Jess, and this is another clear sign that he cares for Jess and he takes an investment in him. Luke feels responsible for Jess's future even though he doesn't have to. I'm sure Liz didn't make him do it. That he's doing on his own. What I find very interesting in that episode is the conversation that Rory has with Jess about going to college. When Rory asks why he is not going, he says, "Ask my mother, ask my principal, ask your mother." So it looks like he's impacted by how others see him. He feels like he won't go anywhere because no one expects anything of him. We then have the car accident, and as soon as Luke finds out about the car accident, the first thing that he asks is if anyone is hurt. And then when Lorelai mentions that Rory got hurt, Luke asks if Jess was hurt. Jess is his priority. Then Luke goes off to look for Jess. He has to make sure that Jess is okay. Luke doesn't attack Jess. He doesn't judge him. He's there to support Jess. He doesn't say anything except, "I know you did," when Jess says that he made sure that Rory wasn't hurt. In the following episode, Luke says that he called Jess's mom to make sure that he got home okay. And he also confirms for Rory that he knows that it wasn't Jess's fault. In the season finale, Luke is freezing Lorelai out, and he's been doing so since episode 20 because he's upset with Lorelai about how she flipped out on him. I think his anger is fair, and Lorelai's reaction was also reasonable. Luke is also reasonable in how he feels. He cares about Jess, and he didn't like how his nephew was attacked. Jess comes back to Stars Hollow in the season finale, and the show suggests that it is because of Rory. But I like to think that Luke played a part in it as well. And this scene where Jess comes to Luke to ask if he can come back, I think is very beautiful. Luke says that he called Jess 6 times, that he just wanted to know if he got on the bus. And he leaves Jess hanging for a bit before he says that he can come back, but that things are going to have to be different. And Luke did not pack up Jess's stuff, and Jess picks up on that fact. Season 2 between them really highlights the fact that Luke spent his time constantly reaching out to Jess. Luke did everything that he could based on how he sees the world, how he sees himself, his personality to help Jess out. His efforts have been very genuine, and throughout season 2, although there are some very minor glimpses that Jess cares about Luke, it's primarily Luke constantly reaching out to Jess to show him that he is cared for and loved. Season 3 is where we start to see more signs from Jess that he sees Luke really as his family and someone who he feels very comfortable with. In episode 4, Luke tries to have a conversation with Jess about having a girl in a closet. So he has this guy-to-guy talk with Jess about how to treat women. So not only is Luke invested in Jess doing well in school, but he also wants Jess to grow up into a man that treats women well. And they have this very interesting conversation where Jess pushes back on Luke about his relationship. They're both talking about one of the Gilmore Girls, so it shows how they relate to each other so much. There's a funny scene in the following episode where Luke is ranting about a woman who is breastfeeding in his diner, and Lorelai and Rory are justifiably very amused by Luke's reaction, but what's even better is that Jess comes downstairs and he has the same reaction as Luke when he sees the woman breastfeeding, which is kind of absurd and funny, but at the same time shows that, oddly enough, Luke and Jess have similar reaction to mundane things like breastfeeding. In episode 6, Jess gets a car, and Luke didn't know about the car. He didn't know how he got it, but even though Luke is questioning Jess's decisions, he still signed for Jess's registration. So he lets Jess make his own decisions. It's also in this episode that Luke makes fun of Jess for working at Walmart, and some people thought that this was a little cruel that he was mocking Jess for working at this job, but I don't think that Luke was actually making fun of Jess for working at a place like Walmart because it's a manual labor job. It was because Jess is working for quote-unquote the man. Luke works at a diner, so he would not make fun of Jess for working a blue-collar job, but Walmart is very corporate, and Jess is this edgy personality. He has this rebel persona. Luke calls him an all-American boy, makes fun of him for eating apple pie. So Luke's mockery is really all about making fun of Jess for conforming and working for corporate America. So although that scene is kind of silly, I like the fact that it's not just Jess teasing Luke. The relationship is both ways. Luke can also make fun of Jess because they've already began to establish this type of relationship together. In episode 8, Jess finally gets together with Rory, and Luke is extremely happy about that. Luke also becomes very much a dad in this episode. He's very protective of Rory, and we can tell he's very hard on Jess when it comes to Rory, and I think that he's being a parent to both of them in that episode, and this is the first time that we see Luke actually becoming overbearing when it comes to Jess. I don't know how much I agree with Luke's overbearing nature, but I think that's just part of his character trait. And as the season progresses, we see that Jess is showing more and more interest in Luke. In episode 12, we have Nicole showing up. This is Dosie's lawyer, and Nicole and Luke have a conversation. Jess points out to Luke that Nicole was flirting with him, and Jess is clearly teasing Luke, but he's also actually being encouraging. That's Jess's way of supporting Luke. And in fact, Luke actually asks Nicole out on a date because of Jess's teasing. So Jess is pushing Luke to do something. We see that Jess is then very happy. He's smiling when Luke asks her out, and this is also where we start to see that Jess becomes more consistent when he's working at the diner, which was Luke's condition for letting Jess stay, but we see there's a change in Jess in this season. He works for Luke without a fight. In a later episode, episode 13, Jess is again teasing Luke for looking up a restaurant to take Nicole out, and again we see that Jess is interested in what Luke is doing. When Luke and Nicole are on a date, Jess does this really great scene where he's like, hey, I'm going to be out for an hour, and he repeats it multiple times, which I think think he's actually being sincere in that scene. He's actually thinking that he's doing Luke a favor. Very funny. He's not doing Luke any favors, but it's a genuine effort on Jess's part to help a guy out. In episode 14, Jess gets a black eye, courtesy of a swan, and Luke asks Jess about the black eye, and of course, Jess doesn't want to tell him anything, but he breaks eventually and he tells them, which I think is notable because he was too embarrassed to tell anyone else, specifically Rory. So it looks like at this point, Jess has this confidence and this relationship with Luke where he feels comfortable enough to actually talk to him about things that he really can't speak to others about. When they're out on the lake hunting down the swan, Jess and Luke have another heart-to-heart conversation, and Luke actually gives Jess some really good advice. He tells him that Rory comes with the family, she comes with an entire package, and the whole jealousy that Jess has with Dean is not only unjustified but unhealthy, that it would only push Rory away. In episode 17, Jess gets Employee of the Month at Walmart, and Luke is so proud. He's so proud that he wants to talk to Lorelai about it, so he's happy enough that he wants to brag. Then he's super proud he even goes to the ceremony, which I think not many people go to, and this pride is killed as soon as Luke finds out that Jess has been cutting school. In the following episode, in episode 18, we see again that Jess encourages Luke. So Jess is the one who told Luke to meet Nicole's parents, which I think really demonstrates the fact that Jess is in many ways looking out for Luke. We also learn and confirm that Jess has in fact been skipping school, and this harkens back to his original conversation with Rory about going to college and about graduating. He really doesn't seem to see school as something that's an option, probably because he has grown up to believe that he's never going to amount to anything. Luke, I think, takes a very good approach when it comes to Jess addressing the skipping school issue. He's incredibly supportive. Rather than just yelling at Jess right away, Luke tries to tell him, hey, I'm going to give you a raise. I'm going to give you money. I could pay for the car insurance. So he starts off by saying, hey, I'm here to support you. And the best way that I could support you is to give you money so that you don't have to work so much, which I think is a good way to start off that conversation. But of course, when Jess resists, they get into a big fight, and Luke ends up hiding Jess's car so that Jess would eventually go to school. By episode 19, the reality hits Jess, and he's not graduating. He finds out that he's flunking out and he cannot get the prom tickets. Episode 20 of season 3 becomes quite a big episode for Jess. This is where his father shows up at the diner. Luke finds out, he goes to Jimmy's house, who is the dad, and this is where we learned what happened to Jess's father. So apparently, Jimmy went out for diapers one night and then he never came back, so he just abandoned his newborn son and the mother of his son without any word. Luke's anger with Jimmy, I think, is incredibly justified. I also understand why Luke decided not to tell Jess, because he sensed that it would only bring more heartache and more pain, and his priority, again, is always Jess. I think it's also worth mentioning that in this episode, we could see that Jess is working really hard at the diner, and he almost has a grumpy behavior like Luke does when he works, which I think suggests that, first of all, customer service, and this is what happens when someone has to work at a very busy diner for a long period of time, but also some of their similarities when it comes to a stressful work environment. To be fair, I don't see them as the same characters. I do see that Luke and Jess are very different in terms of their personality, but they have similarities that tie them together that I think make them work well in a family unit. When Jess finds out that his father is in town, he naturally wants to have a conversation with him, and he is then later angry with Luke about not telling him, which I understand. Something that I think is also very painful is that as soon as Jimmy sits down and Jess is ready to pour him coffee to have a conversation, Jimmy just bolts out the door. So not only has he abandoned his son once, but then he finds his 17-year-old son who's all grown up, and then he bolts on him again. Luke and Jess have a big falling out, which is very much anticipated. Luke is angry with Jess for flunking out of school. He says that he has to graduate in order to live here. Jess is not down for that at all, and he leaves. In the next episode, Luke tells Lorelai that Jess is gone, and Luke says that he's relieved, but Lorelai can tell that he's upset. And this is another great acting moment from Scott Patterson. It's very subtle. He just says,
I failed him.
Ultimately, season 3 is where we see Luke and Jess bonding as a family and starting to rely on each other. There are still no overt signs of affection from Jess, but they have reached a point where they feel comfortable enough to talk to each other about various topics, and Jess does go to Luke as his parental figure. We could see that in when his car gets egged, he calls Luke over. We could see that in the fact that Jess feels comfortable to talk to Luke about more serious topics. Season 4 is where we get to see reciprocation from Jess. Even though Jess is only in 4 episodes, those 4 episodes are very notable for developing the relationship. In episode 12, Liz comes to Stars Hollow, and we find out that Liz and Luke haven't seen each other in 3 years. And also in this episode, Jess gets picked up by the cops because his car breaks down on the highway. So Jess comes to Stars Hollow to pick up his car because his mom told him that it was there. Jess is quite harsh with Luke when he sees him, when he goes to pick up the car, and Luke is naturally very upset with Jess because Jess didn't check in, he didn't write. And it was in this episode that I realized that Luke actually gave Jess an ultimatum, that Luke did say you have to graduate or you can't stay here, and for a kid probably feels like a conditional love, that you only want me only if I do what you tell me. It's really hard to say who is right and who's wrong in an ultimatum situation when it comes to a parental relationship. When you find out a kid is flunking out, or you find out that they've been battling vampires in their free time, that ultimatum may be coming from a gut reaction without thinking and without intention. I don't think that Luke actually wanted to kick Jess out, but I think Jess took it very literally. Luke also tells Jess that he can't stay with him, so Jess decides to sleep in the car. But of course, Luke cannot allow that to happen, and then there's an incredibly sweet moment where Luke says, I'm gonna go stay with Nicole, take my apartment, and then Luke waits in his truck to make sure that Jess gets into the apartment. In the following episode, in episode 12, Jess shows up at Luke's apartment when Liz is there with TJ, so they introduce TJ into the scene, and I think that Jess sits down and stays for Luke, not for his mom. And Luke asks for Jess's help in dealing with TJ. Jess doesn't care about TJ, but Luke is insisting that something has to be done. Jess says she really doesn't care what I think, because I think Jess knows his mom better than Luke does, and he has been putting up with it his entire life. This is where the scene, it becomes a bit harsh from Jess's end, and he says, you see, this is your problem. You're gonna help people whether they want to or not. You have to fix everything.
You make it so that when people fail you get to feel like the martyr, and they get to feel like not only did they screw up, but they also disappointed you.
Jess's statement comes off as harsh, but what I think is very compelling is the fact that what Jess really wants to say is that he probably feels the pressure from Luke. He feels guilty and he feels like he disappointed Luke. So the outrage that Jess has, I think, runs deeper. And I think it runs deep into Jess's own guilt and feeling of responsibility, because at this point, he probably knows how much Luke cares about him. And Jess feels that he might have disappointed Luke, and that's what hurts him. That's what causes Jess to lash out. He probably resents Luke for making him feel this way. And this hits Luke really hard. When rewatching this scene, I never really noticed before, but the pain of hearing that someone that you tried to take care of says that you are an unwelcome burden to everyone around, not the easiest thing to hear. In episode 20, Liz gets married and she tells Luke that Jess is not coming to the wedding, so Luke goes all the way to New York City to tell Jess that he has to go. I like how even though Jess was mean to Luke before, Luke still comes. When Jess shows up in town, Luke is very happy to see him. At the bachelor party for TJ, Luke needs Jess there as a support system. And at the bachelor party, in the conversation between TJ and Jess, TJ throws a book out of Jess's hands and they get into a fight, which I think for an adult was probably not the most appropriate thing to do. Luke talks to Jess about his actions, and Jess just sits there and listens. He's not fighting back. It's very notable how much he has changed. He's willing to listen to Luke. He knows that what has been happening is messed up, and he's willing to sit there and be chastised by Luke. Jess admits that he came to Stars Hollow for the wedding because of Luke. And Jess confesses to Luke that he told Rory that he loves her, and that was the reason why he didn't want to go to the wedding. It was all because of Rory. But Jess still showed up because he cares more about Luke than he does in trying to avoid Rory. I like how Jess feels confident to talk to Luke about his relationship. The fact that Jess is able to talk to Luke about such deep feelings shows a lot. And this is where Luke gives Jess the self-help book that he has been reading. The following episode, episode 21, it's Liz's wedding day. And Luke and Jess get ready for the wedding, and again, we could see the support system that they have. They get ready together. Jess is very teasing when it comes to Luke. We also see that Jess is reading the book that Luke gave him, and I wonder if a part of Jess's willingness to read the book is the fact that it was Luke that gave it to him. Then, in a scene that I absolutely adore, Jess stays back after the wedding to say goodbye to Luke. He hung back long after the wedding. He waited for Luke to come home. And Jess so sincerely and so honestly tells Luke that he wants to pay him back for everything and that he appreciates everything that Luke has done for him. This is the first overt sign from Jess of appreciation, and he means it very honestly. It's an incredibly beautiful moment.
You're hoping for reciprocation? You got it.
I'm here, Jess. I'm always here.
Season 6 is where we see the final form of the relationship between Jess and Luke. This is the relationship that continues throughout the revival. It's the final form between Luke and Jess. In episode 8, Jess visits Stars Hollow. We find out that he has published a book, that he's been living in Philly, and he works at a publishing press. There are no scenes between Jess and Luke, but we do know that he went to see Luke first. He found out about Rory's living situation, about where she is now, and Jess tells Rory that he could not have published a book without her. But I do feel like some of that credit should go to Luke as well, because Luke has always been his support system, at least ever since he came to Stars Hollow. In episode 18, Jess is at his publishing house, Truncheon Books, and he's having a poetry reading, I think. What I love in that scene is that Jess gets a very sweet smile on his face as soon as he sees Luke and he comes up to him. This is Jess's publishing business, and he didn't think that Luke would come, so he sent Luke an invitation, but he wasn't sure he would even be there. He then takes the time to talk about the business that he has. He shows how things work around here. The way that they interact in that scene is how two people who know each other really well and who can talk to each other candidly act, like two adults. Jess is very mature in this episode, and Jess tries to pay Luke back for everything. Luke says that he's very proud of him, and I think it probably means a lot to Jess that Luke is proud of him. In the revival, A Year in the Life, we see the relationship that we saw form in season 4. In the summer episode, Jess shows up at the Gazette that Rory works at, and Jess came to town because he has to do some mom maintenance with Luke. So apparently Liz has joined a cult with TJ, and he has to work with Luke on it. So we kind of see how Jess has come around, where earlier Luke has to go all the way to New York to find Jess to come to a wedding, but now Jess is very actively trying to save his mom from various situations, and he has to come get Luke for it, so they have teamed up together. We also see another full circle in this episode where Jess suggests to Rory that she write a book about her and her mom. So Rory inspired Jess to write, and he inspired her to write. In the final episode in fall, Jess comes to the diner looking for Luke because they have to go get his mom, but apparently, as it turns out, Liz and TJ were so outlandish that the cult kicked them out. But that's no longer relevant. What becomes so relevant is that Jess is checking in on Luke. He's asking if he's okay. Now he's there to look out for him. And in this episode, they both sit down to have a conversation because Luke is having trouble with Lorelai, and this is where Luke has to come to Jess, and Jess is there to be his support system. Jess is now very invested in Luke, and he needs to know how he's doing. There's a very interesting foreshadowing moment in season 2, episode 6. In the episode where Jess dresses up like Luke to tease him and Luke sends him upstairs, Lorelai, looking at that scene, she turns to Rory and she says,
You know, I'm really lucky.
Yeah, why?
I have someone to complain to when life sucks or work sucks or just everything sucks. I have someone I can talk to.
and it's a very interesting foreshadowing moment because she says this while she's looking at Jess and Luke. And as it turns out, Jess and Luke become that for each other later on.
They have amazing communication.